So my first question is, there you were happily situated as the president of the South Dakota College of Mines and Technology, and you get a call from the Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, who says, hey, we want you to think about becoming the Secretary of the Air Force. Now, we know you're a pilot. You would have become the first woman to be a pilot to head one of the services.
Actually, the only, I don't think there's been man or woman, a pilot who's ever been Secretary of the Air Force.
All right,
Seems kind of odd.
Man or woman. So when he called you, what did you think? Any hesitation?
Yes. In fact, honest to goodness, this is what I said. When he said, this is Jim Mattis, and I want to talk to you about becoming Secretary of the Air Force, I said, sir, you do know that being a college president is like the best job in America, right? And he said, yeah, I know, I just came from Stanford. And then I said, you know, and I'm kind of a gal of the West. I'm out here in the mountains. I can hike and bike and fly fish. I love my students. And he said, yeah, I know, I'm from the Columbia River myself. And so we talked several different conversations on the phone, and I talked to other people about him and about the challenges the Air Force are facing. And in the end, he made pretty clear that my draft number was up. And so I was called back to serve.
And you moved to Washington. So let's get right to this question of readiness, which is something you have raised as Secretary. You've said that the Air Force, with 660,000 airmen, and that includes the women, who you point out are 25% of the active
service, yep.
of the active service. You've got a $132 billion budget. But you've said it's too small for the missions the nation is expecting of the Air Force, and as a result, you're stretched very thin.
Yes.
How serious is the problem, and how do you illustrate it? What are some examples?
Well, let me give you a couple of examples. First of all, the Air Force has been continuously in combat since 1991, since the Gulf War. We never came home. And just this weekend, so while all of us were out on a 3-day weekend, the United States Air Force put over 300 precision munitions against ISIS in Syria and Iraq. We're fighting in combat every day. And I don't think Americans are entirely aware of that. But today, we have 55 fighter squadrons, 55. In the Gulf War in 1991, when Saddam Hussein went into Kuwait, we had 134. We are a third the size that we were, but the requirements haven't eased. And that means that a tanker pilot is spending 6 months in the Gulf and 6 months at home. And 6 months, so surge is the new normal, and it's wearing out our people.
Well, in connection with that, we saw last summer vividly, not the Air Force we were hearing about, but the Navy had a series of highly publicized accidents in the Pacific theater, with vessels that were literally involved in accidents. The conclusion after a review was that the Navy was overstretched and undertrained, that there weren't enough personnel, there wasn't enough training to get the job done right. Does the Air Force have the same problem the Navy does?
Yes, we do. One of the things that I was most surprised at when I returned to the service was to look at the readiness weights, and we look at training for missions. So a squadron will have a variety of missions they're responsible for being trained to conduct, and particularly for what we call the high-end fight. So not the fight against violent extremists who don't have an Air Force, but to project power in the Pacific or in the European theater. We are not fully ready. But here's what that means. It means we will still go, but fewer airmen will come back. That's what low readiness means. And that's the risk at which we're putting our airmen.
Does the United States Congress understand that?
I'm not sure they do, Judy. We are now in the 9th straight year of starting the year under a continuing resolution. Sequester is still the law of the land. And if this service goes through sequester, we will freeze civilian hiring. We will ground aircraft that are not in the fight today or spinning up to go to the fight. I'm already 1,500 fighter pilots short because we're just burning out our people. And we will break this force.
So in a few sentences, what do you need to correct this?
I need a predictable budget. And we need the Congress to take this off autopilot and take the stick and fly this thing. And so predictable budgets, We're not going to get out of this this is not a one-year kind of fix. This is some predictable budgets and some commitment to some things like space, rebuilding the nuclear deterrent, and modernizing our aircraft.
Well, I think it's grim. It's scary even for people to hear you say that not as many will come back because of the readiness, the number of individuals who are trained to do the job. But I want to connect that right now to the Korean Peninsula, because we're hearing a lot, the American people are hearing a lot about tension between the United States and North Korea. I mean, to the point that people are wondering, are we going to go to war with the North? We've heard a lot of rhetoric coming from the president, both coming from the leader of North Korea. What should the American people think right now? Are we, I've read trained, highly respected analysts say we are closer to war now than we've been at any time since 1953 and the signing of the armistice. How much on alert are we as a country?
The United States Air Force needs to be ready. And so the whole Department of Defense is poised to support the diplomatic efforts of Secretary Tillerson. So we want everybody in the world, particularly those who would wish us harm, to want to deal with Secretary Tillerson and not Secretary Mattis. That's kind of our objective here. And the Air Force's responsibility and my responsibility is to try to make sure that we have trained and ready forces for any decision that's made to protect the vital national interests of this country.
Do you think it's accurate, the comment that I quoted, that the United States is closer to conflict, to war, than at any time since the armistice?
You know, you think back at some of the times that we've had with tensions with North Korea before, shoot down of aircraft. I don't know if you will recall, and I'm trying to remember the year that that there was an incident in the DMZ with the killing of soldiers who had gone out to trim a tree. There have been tensions with North Korea before. We probably have not been at a place where they are so close to having a nuclear capability and the ability to deliver it. And I think that is obviously a very serious concern.
Well, I want to pick up on this issue of tensions. It's been widely reported this past week, this comment by the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Bob Corker of Tennessee, who said in an interview last week that Secretary Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary Tillerson, and White House Chief of Staff John Kelly are all that separate our country from chaos. How do you see the role of these three individuals in our government?
I would say that Secretary Mattis is one of the best leaders I have ever worked for. And I have to say that, you know, before I came as a president of a university, as a member of Congress, as a business owner, one of the things that I got used to is being my own boss. So you become kind of careful about who you work for. Secretary Mattis gives mission orders. He is an inspiring leader. He tries to get good people to work with him and for him and give him a general direction to go in. And he's an exceptional leader, and I'm privileged to work for him.
What was your reaction when you heard that comment from Senator Corker?
Everybody has their own perspective. I think my personal view is that America is a pretty rock-solid place, and we're a resilient place. And sometimes Washington seems to get pretty full of itself, and I think there is real strength and calm when you're in Rapid City, South Dakota. No, I mean, really, most Americans are going on with their daily lives, and they don't really much care about the rhetoric that swirls around this city. One of the delightful things, I'll tell you, is that the Pentagon is not largely affected by that either. The members of the United States military focus on the mission that we have to do to make sure that we are ready and trained, and a lot of the stuff that swirls around doesn't penetrate.
Except to the extent that when the conversation comes around to national security, it can affect the mission of the Pentagon.
Well, our mission is to be prepared and have ready forces and options for the Secretary of Defense and for the National Command Authority.
I want to ask you a question about our nuclear arsenal in this country. We've also, that's come up as a consequence of what's going on with North Korea. The Air Force oversees much of the nation's nuclear arsenal, the ICBMs, the bomber wing, the nuclear laboratories, and maybe others.
We do not have the nuclear laboratories. Those are in the Department of Energy.
Those are in the Department of Energy,
Yes.
Thank you. So the president has talked about beefing up the American nuclear arsenal. He's also talked about the cost of modernizing our nuclear arsenal. How much modernization is needed? We
have two legs of the nuclear triad in the United States Air Force. The airborne leg, which is the bombers, and we are moving forward with the modernization of what we call the long-range standoff missile, which will replace the air-launched cruise missile, which is aging. Those mostly go on B-52s now. The second part is the Minuteman Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, the ICBM. That missile is so old that trying to extend its life just doesn't make any sense anymore. It's very hard to maintain. The materials just wear out. We still use what were, in the late 1970s, it was really high-end technology. We actually have 8-inch floppy disks in this thing. And so it's time to modernize those, and we've moved forward with the beginning contracts to do that as well. How much money are we talking about? It's a substantial amount of money. I actually would probably get it wrong if I tried to add it all up in my head. But this is a modernization program over a significant period of time, and we haven't touched our nuclear deterrent for a long period of time. If we're going to have a safe, secure, and reliable nuclear deterrent, we have to modernize. So if, God forbid, there were some sort of incident that called for a nuclear response, is the U.S. arsenal in shape to do the job it was meant to do? Yes. Despite what you just said about it being aging and... That's correct. It's much more difficult to maintain, and it's more costly to maintain than to actually modernize these capabilities. Our job is a deterrent job, and to make sure that worst day never comes, because we're ready and we are deterring any attack on the United States. I want to ask you about a particular theater, Turkey. Again, a place that's been in the news a lot. There is a critically important strategic air base in Turkey at Incirlik, U.S. air base, yes. That the U.S. uses for that entire theater that is North Africa, the Middle East, Asia, Europe. Right now there are tensions, again, in the news today, tensions with Turkey. The leader of Turkey kicked out the staff at the U.S. consulate in Istanbul. This has come up before, but is there any concern that that at some point Turkey might say, you don't have access to that base anymore? The United States and Turkey have had close relations for a very long time, and I hope that these most recent issues are resolved. But the coalition that's together in the Central Command Area of Authority, so in the Middle East and Afghanistan, has 26 nations. The Chief of Staff and I went forward to that region, and it is a remarkable testament to the strength of an alliance. And it's one of the things that America benefits from, are having so many allies. You think about our adversaries in the world, many of them are on their own because their ideology and their freedom doesn't appeal to other countries. They're afraid of them. And with the United States, we do have allies. People want to be allied with the United States of America. Speaking of allies, as we all know, early in the administration, the president spoke a great deal about how the other NATO countries, members, were not holding up their end of the bargain with regard to paying dues and so forth. How important is it that the United States remain in that NATO alliance, do you think? I served in NATO and at NATO headquarters in the 1980s as a young officer, and I believe that we're stronger together than any one of us would be alone, and that our allies are vitally important. Now, we had arguments back in the 70s and the 80s about burden sharing. Can you remember those? So it's always a discussion about, who is contributing how much to the collective self-defense. But there's no question in my mind that we're stronger together and that our allies are very, very important to us. Very different subject. In the last month or so, the president issued an order with regard to individuals in the military who are transgender. How has that affected the Air Force? There are fairly small numbers affected, but the Chief of Staff and I have tried to make clear that we treat everyone with dignity and respect. And when we get new guidance from the Secretary of Defense, we'll implement that guidance. But every airman who is wearing the uniform is an airman, and they're worthy of dignity and respect.
What is the guidance right now? What is the guidance right now?
There is a working group that the Secretary of Defense's office has gathered together, and anyone who is in the service is continuing in the service, and we are not bringing in any additional transgender, we call them accessions, but people who enlist. That working group is working out the policies that will go into effect early next year.
Heather Wilson, Secretary of the Air Force, thank you very much for talking to us.